Well, as expected, y'all are excessively kind and generous. But Sally and I really appreciate the chance to be with you tonight and to share a few moments with you. I think the first and probably the most important thing I can say tonight is for all of you who have served in the military and all of you who are serving in the military, on behalf of my family and on behalf of the people I'm privileged to represent from the 13th District of Texas, thank you very much for your service. Your service is something we will always honor and always be grateful for. And let me say really quickly, the other most important thing I can say is for the spouses and the families of those who serve and have served, thank you for your service as well. Being in politics, we have some sort of idea of how it goes for these jobs that encompass the whole family and a whole way of life. And so I think Sally and I have grown to have a real appreciation for the service of the families and especially the spouses for those who serve our nation in the military. You know, if you think about it, joining the military is kind of a strange thing to do in our modern culture. Because you give up a lot of your own self decision making. You got to follow orders from somebody else. You lose some of your privacy. You even give up some of your rights. And so if you look at it the way that many in our country look at things these days, like what's in it for me, it's kind of a strange thing to do. But as you all know better than anybody, from the Revolutionary War to today, we in America have fortunately had these people who do this strange thing and give up something of themselves and serve our nation. And when you get beyond the media hype of the actors and the sports heroes and the people, you know, that get all the attention, and when you dig down a little deeper, that's where you find the people who are doing their job, contributing to their community, worshiping their Lord, and serving their nation. That's where the heroes really are. And so from a moral standpoint, as well as just a practical standpoint, it is the people that are the centerpiece of our country's security. And I don't need to tell you that as if I'm educating you, but I just want you to know that I understand that. And I think all the members of the Armed Services Committee understand that it's the people that are central. We can make mistakes on weapon systems and we can do this and that on stuff we buy, but it's the people that make up for any deficiencies. It's the people that give us the edge over any potential competitor, and it's the people that we have to make sure that we have our eye on at all times. It is certainly an incredible honor for me to serve as chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. And in that capacity, as General Robertson said, to look for whatever I can do to support those people that are the centerpiece of our national security. And it's particularly an honor, and I got to say it's a little daunting to do that in the times in which we live. Now we've had, I've done our hearings a little differently this year. We've had essentially 3 months of looking at the problems we face, because it seems to me you need to understand the challenges in the national security environment before you really can figure out what course is best. And we've had witnesses that have come and testified that at least since the end of World War II, and maybe ever, has the country faced so many serious national security challenges all at the same time. And so that's why I say it's a little daunting to think about all of those challenges that we face. I'm just thinking a little bit about today, my day today. We had a hearing in our committee on the Pacific region. So we had the commander of PACOM, we had General Scaparrotti in charge of our forces in Korea, talking about many of the challenges that China poses, for example, to our technological superiority. We talked about the challenges from North Korea. We talked about some of the challenges in the southern part of the Pacific region. I had to leave that hearing a little bit early because I was asked to come to a meeting that the leadership had with the Prime Minister of Iraq. You start thinking about the challenges he faces with the Iranian influence, about his army basically dissolving and him having to put it back together, and you think about the growth of ISIS in that region, the threat it poses to him, the threat it poses to the region, the threat it poses to us, and then week before last, I spent the week in Eastern Europe, where visiting Romania and Poland and Lithuania and Ukraine, where we've got the Russian bear breathing down their necks. All sorts of challenges, not only in the aggression, but in the tactics that are being used there. You know, the little green men and the deniability and all of that. Meanwhile, every day we've got cyber attacks going. We've got Al-Qaeda has not gone away. And in some ways, Al-Qaeda and ISIS are in competition with each other. And meanwhile, who did we send last summer but the National Guard in Texas to the border to try to deal with 90,000 unaccompanied minors who came up from Central America? And who did we send to Africa to deal with an outbreak of disease? We sent our military. And that's just a sampling. I didn't even talk about the Iranian nuclear deal. It's just a sampling of some of the challenges that are facing our nation and our people at this particular time. Clearly, the world is getting more dangerous. We have a bunch of challenges, and we face some challenges here at home. And y'all talked about them some today when you were storming the Hill. One of our challenges is how we have a more rational, predictable budget for the military and the Department of Defense. One of the things I've done is kind of look back at other countries. And you can't really compare other countries' spending to our spending because they don't pay for all the things that we pay for. But if you did, if you look back over the last 10 years and took inflation out of it, China's military spending has gone up about 170%. Russia's up about 110%. Even India is up about 45%. You know, we always hear this argument, well, we've got lots of problems here at home. We don't have more problems at home than India does. And yet the United States, we're up about 12% over the last decade. Now that's the good news. The rest of the story is, if you look at the last 4 years, the Department of Defense budget has been cut 18 or 21%, just depending on whether you include inflation, but we have cut our defense spending 20% in the last 4 years. And if you haven't figured it out, the world is not 20% safer now than it was 4 years ago. It's been a mistake. So the good news, and I hope that the show of hands that y'all gave a while ago reflects this. I think the good news is even members of Congress are waking up to what's happening around the world. And I do think opinion is changing, has changed, and is changing to say we cannot continue to cut our military budget anymore. And let me just say, I am incredibly grateful for the help that y'all provide in making sure that message gets to every congressional office, regardless of what committee they serve on, regardless of whether they have a base or not. Y'all are indispensable in helping helping all members of Congress, regardless of their background, understand the damage that comes from the sequestration and the lower budget caps. Another piece of good news, though, is 2 weeks ago, maybe it's 3 weeks ago now, the last week in March when we were last here before the Easter break, both the House and the Senate had votes on a budget And both the House and the Senate passed budgets that turn that around and start to increase the amount of money that we spend on defense. Now, we hadn't got it all sorted out yet. We still have to have an agreed House and Senate budget. It does not fix sequestration. It is a temporary, kind of messy fix to increase what's called the Overseas Contingency Account, OCO, enough to get up where we need to be. But I got to tell you, I'm encouraged because we had a couple of really clear votes about defense spending. And there's this argument that you're in, and I'm talking Republican here, that you're either a budget hawk or a defense hawk. And the argument is, oh, there's about 50 of these and 50 of those, and everybody else is just, well, we had a vote to test that. And you know what? A huge majority of the Republican conference ended up being for a strong national defense. And I was very encouraged by that vote. And the rest of the story is, I believe a huge majority of the Democratic conference believe that we must end sequestration, especially for the military. So a key focus is we got to see this through. We got to make sure that, and I don't pretend it's adequate funding for the military, but I do believe it has turned the corner so that we are spending more, not less, and that we're on a better track, and we got to see that through. One of my priorities as chairman is at the same time to ensure that we have reforms in the Department of Defense to make sure that we are as capable as we can possibly be for dealing with this huge array of national security challenges that we face. Now, we need, as particularly those of y'all who have been in the system know, we can always be more efficient in the Department of Defense. And I think we do need to keep working to get better value out of the taxpayer dollars that we spend. But I also believe that with the world changing as fast as it's changing right now, we have got to have the sort of agility in order to pivot from this crisis to that crisis to the unexpected crisis. And to do that requires some reforms and changes. I'll also tell you, I also believe that in order for us to spend more money on defense and convince our colleagues that we need to do that, then we also need to show them that we're willing to oversee and improve the way the Department of Defense operates so that we're not just handing over more money, but we're actually we're making sure that we get more for the money we spend. So I'm, with the committee, trying to pursue 3 avenues of reform. One avenue is acquisition, how we buy and contract for goods and services. I won't, Sally makes fun of me because I get excited about acquisition reform and she says, oh my goodness, don't talk about that again, because it can get a little dull, I admit. But the rest of the story is, if it continues to take us 20 years to field a new airplane, there is no way that we're going to keep up with the change in technology, much less the cyber threat, where the threat moves at the speed of light. I have no illusions that we're going to pass some bill that's going to fix the acquisition system. But I believe that we have a responsibility to the people who serve and to the taxpayers to try to make persistent, continual efforts to improve our acquisition system. And it's not just the weapons and the shiny platforms that seem to attract more attention. The Pentagon actually spends more money on services than it does on weapons and equipment. And frankly, Congress has not done a very good job at looking at services over the years. So one avenue of reform is acquisition. A second avenue of reform is overhead. As y'all know, especially the Army and the Marine Corps, the end strength's been going down lately. If you look at the number of civilians in the Pentagon, it has not been going down. people leaving the Obama administration, Department of Defense, say this is out of hand, there has to be some reforms. And again, there is I've talked to Secretary Carter about this. He agrees and is certainly cooperative in this effort. We need to not only just reduce the number of people, but reduce the number of layers, because each layer adds to the time, adds to the difficulty in getting things done. So a second avenue of reform is reducing overhead. And by the way, a fair number of people say you need to look at overhead at combatant commands as well, as they have grown over time. Third avenue of reform is deals with personnel and compensation. As y'all well know, Congress got tired of administrations from both parties coming to the Hill year after year advocating fee increases and various changes in benefits, most of which we would always reject. But it just kept on nickel and diming, you know, year after year, this, that, and the other part of compensation and benefits. So more than a year ago, we said we need a comprehensive look to look at the full range of pay and benefits, and not just look at how you can save money, but focus on whether it is appropriate sort of pay and compensation system going into the future. Will it enable us to continue to get and keep top quality people that we're going to need to meet this huge array of challenges that we face? And my opinion is the Commission did what we asked them to do. I think they did a very good job of looking at the huge array of pay and compensation. You know, one of the insights for me, I don't know if y'all saw, they published a book that was about this thick of all the different sorts of pays and the way and all the different forms of compensation, much of which hardly anybody knew about. But it was literally about this thick. A lot of things they said are working fine, but some things they said need improvement, and they made, I think, 15 different recommendations. So we're in the process of looking through those recommendations right now. That's a lot of what I'm sure y'all were talking about on the Hill. And we have, in the committee, really benefited from the input we have received from MOAA as well as other organizations. I've read every word of the testimony that MOAA offered to our personnel subcommittee as you were looking through this. I don't know exactly what the committee is going to agree on in a couple weeks' time. My suspicion is that, like your recommendations, we're going to accept some of the things the Commission recommended. We're going to say, I don't think so, about some of the recommendations. And some of them we're going to say, we got to study this a little more. And so, for example, healthcare is probably the most complicated topic anybody at any level of government ever deals with. And so you want to be careful about what you're doing and understand the consequences of it. Some other things that the Commission recommended are things that MOAA and others have recommended for some time. So I think we'll do some of it, and some of it we'll study. Even the things that we try to do in about 2 weeks when the committee is supposed to pass our defense authorization bill is in many ways a placeholder, because after that we've got to go to the floor. The Senate has its whole process, and so it's going to be September at best before we have a final product. And we're going to continue to work to change and improve with your help and with your input, whatever we put into the bill at this point. But we got to keep working at it. One of the things I've come to believe is whether you're dealing with something as important as personnel or whether you're dealing with something as complicated as acquisition, nobody's smart enough to understand what all the right answers are. So what you have to do is put out some suggestions, get feedback, and keep that back and forth process going so you have the collective brains of people who are looking at it, who have experienced it, and who have opinions about it, and that's really the approach that we're going to use. Let me just conclude with a couple other thoughts, and then I'll be happy to see if y'all have questions or suggestions that you did not get to offer today when you were on the Hill. At the end of January, for the first time in years, Republicans and, House and Senate Republicans had a retreat together up in Hershey, Pennsylvania. One of our speakers was former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. And he repeated to us, talked a lot about the Middle East, as you would expect, but he repeated to us advice he has been giving to the United States in a variety of forums, which is, in essence, just be strong. He said, don't worry about whether the world likes you or not. What the world needs is for America to be strong. And I would suggest that what our ancestors fought for, what our children deserve, is also for America to be strong. And America is not strong because of speeches. You know, there's been a fair amount of news that this is the one-year anniversary of the kidnapping of those girls in Nigeria. And the big thing after that happened was to tweet, send back our girls. Well, you know what? They haven't come back, because that's not going to be effective in returning kidnapped girls, just as a Facebook post is not going to be effective in preventing people from beheading Christians or burning them alive, or all these terrible atrocities that we have seen. The only thing that's effective in stopping those sorts of atrocities, in stopping that sort of evil, is military power. And as y'all well know, make no mistake, there is evil in the world, and there will continue to be evil in the world that requires the United States of America, which is the greatest force for good that has ever existed, to be strong and to have that military power that enables us to be strong. So I just want to reiterate gratitude for everyone's service to our country, but also gratitude for your continuing service. I love that, because I got to tell you, the country needs you now. I don't know if I can say as much as ever, but it needs you now a lot. And it needs those voices for a strong military, for a strong national defense. And my thought is, y'all play a key role, of course, when you come to Washington and when you get into all those offices and let all members of Congress know what's important, what we need to be thinking about, how it affects the people who serve in the military. But you also play a key role when you go back home and are leading voices in your communities about what's happening in the world and about how essential it is for us, for the United States to be strong, to have a strong national defense. Sometimes, like probably a lot of y'all, I get asked, what worries you the most? What keeps you up at night? And they think it's going to be cyber or terrorism or variety of things. The truth is, I don't worry about any of that stuff. I believe the United States can overcome any adversary, whatever form it takes. What worries me the most is what we do to ourselves, because I think it is only what we do to ourselves that can limit our ability to continue to be the greatest, strongest, freest country in the history of the world. Y'all help us very much stay on the right path so that we don't do dumb things to ourselves, and that we continue to get and keep the top quality people that allows us to overcome any threat, any obstacle in the future. Again, thank you for that, and thank you for having us here tonight. again, oh, thank you, ma'am. She's always looking out for me. If your time allows, and Admiral, I'll just let you tell me when you need to move on. I'm happy to take some questions or just get off the stage if you prefer. Okay, all right, great. I'm sorry, I'm probably like everybody else not going to be able to see very well, so I'll count on Mike to.
Service. What progress do you see being made in eliminating this injustice for us? It's been 14 years.
Yeah. Well, as you know, the Commission looked at some of these issues and made some recommendations that addressed some of the spousal benefit issues. On the offsets, it has, as you point out, it has been a continuing problem, not just for surviving spouses, but for other sorts of offsets too. I don't know that, I'm not going to tell you that Congress is going to go fix that this year, because and I'm sure you know this, but just to back up for a second, not everybody understands that 2/3 of the federal budget these days is mandatory spending or entitlement programs that are growing at a rapid rate. I mentioned defense has been cut 20% in the last 4 years. Defense is now down to about 16% of the federal budget. And my point of that is, whether it's Social Security offsets or other sorts of ways that the various federal programs interact with each other, it has been difficult to find an answer that does not exacerbate the growth of entitlements, which Congress has just not been able to come to grips with. So I think it's definitely on the radar screen, but I can't tell you that, especially given all the other challenges that we face this year, that that offset is going to go away. I'm sorry. Yeah, there you go.
I'm Richard Smith, the president for the Illinois Council of Chapters, and I would like to know, sir, I was a 33-year military veteran of the Air Force, and I would like to know what your initial impressions are of the military compensation and retirement modernization commission.
Yeah, well, that's what I was talking about. I think they did a good job. They did what we asked them to do, and I think it was particularly helpful to look at the full range of pay and benefits, not just nickel and diming things for a cheap, for to save money here and there. But as I've mentioned, I think some of their recommendations are going to require further study. Some of their recommendations I hope we can adopt quickly. Some of the recommendations we may put a placeholder in and keep working on. But I have nothing but appreciation for the folks who served on that commission, because I think, one of the things we don't do very well in Congress is look at the big picture. And we tend to just look at narrow things without really understanding the whole context. What they were asked to do, and I think what they did, was to look and say, okay, if we're going to compete with the private sector in the next 20, 30, 40 years, what sort of pay and compensation system will allow us to continue to attract and to retain those top quality people that we're going to need to fight the nation's wars, whether they be on the ground, underwater, in the air, or in cyberspace, or in outer space. So I appreciate that. Now, I don't think they believe that we were just going to rubber stamp their recommendations. Congress doesn't usually work that way very well. So, but I think they did what we asked. I appreciate it, and I think we're going to do a bunch of what they recommended in some form or another.
Over here, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. I'm a captain in the National Guard focused on cyber, and I'm part of the MOAA currently serving advisory committee. And so my question is, do you see any realistic prospects in terms of fixing sequestration in the long term? I know you talked about the short term and interim steps, but in the long term, sir?
I think we can, and honestly, I don't think it's that hard if there's the desire to do so. And you know, I think that given the political situation we're in, well, let me back up. I think overwhelming majorities in both parties in Congress believe that we need to end sequestration or the Budget Control Act limitations for the Department of Defense. And then the question is, okay, if you do it for the military, do you have to do it for the domestic programs as well? And you know, the truth is, there's some important things the federal government does, medical research comes to mind, that have suffered under this sequestration regime too. So I think it's possible that we could end sequestration for both domestic and military programs. But it gets back to what we were talking about. The 2/3 of the budget that has been untouched through all this has been the mandatory spending programs. And so even the President has made a number of recommendations for entitlement reform, taking that and using it to offset so you don't increase the deficit, but then you provide some relief on the discretionary side. I don't think it's that hard. Now the question is, are there enough people in Congress and the White House who want to do that? I don't know. I can't tell you. What I can tell you is that we got to go step by step through this, and the first step was to pass a budget with adequate military funding. We're at the level that the President requested. We're at the level that General Dempsey says is the lower ragged edge of what it takes to defend the country. We're going to authorize spending to that level. The appropriators are in the House and the Senate are going to appropriate to that level. And then we're going to give the President a chance to sign a defense appropriation bill, I think, at the level he requested. We'll see what he does. And we'll just push on from there.
Congressman Jack Sheehan, Marine.
Sir.
One of the issues in the military is the absence of foreign policy framework to decide how they're going to shape the force to do what. Could you comment on what your committee is doing to help this debate about what our foreign policy really is? Because both our allies and I think a lot of the kids in the military are confused as to what we do.
I share your view, and whether one travels to East Asia or the Middle East or Eastern Europe, there's confusion about what our policy is and frankly doubts about our reliability as an ally. I think that's true. And as a matter of, well, and so I think it is important. One of the things I've tried to do in 3 months is to step back and look at the bigger picture. I mean, you've already heard me kind of give some of my biases. I think Congress tends to look too much down at the weeds and misses the forest. And so we are trying to look at the bigger picture of these trends, where they are headed, and what our role in the world is. And I think you're exactly right. We got to sort through that. We maybe don't have to answer all the questions. We've got to sort through that and come to a clear understanding before we can make other decisions. So, for example, one of the things that I get beat up on the most is about having another BRAC. Well, part of my answer is that we need to really have a better understanding of what we see our role in the world being, from which we can decide what sort of force structure we need, from which we can then decide what sort of basing and training are needed to support that force structure. But I'm pretty reluctant to just give up a bunch of bases and training ranges when we may come to a couple years and say, boy, I wish I had that back. So I think that putting first things first and trying to have a better understanding of what our approach to the world is something that we need to do better on to help inform the judgments we make about weapon systems and various, decisions that we make each year in our defense bills. But we're not going to achieve that all in 1 year, of course. But I think, but you know what? Sorry, this is a little rambling. Just listening to my constituents all last week in the 13th District of Texas, I think that's where the people of the country are. One of the things that is so different than it was when I was first elected is now these world crises come into our living rooms. And so people see what Putin is doing. They see the North Korean missile launches. They see what ISIS does and the mess in Syria and Iraq and so forth. And so they're asking the same kind of questions. What is our role in dealing with those things? If not us, who? But can we really solve this? And so I think that's encouraging. There is more. I don't know if y'all saw in running around the Hill today, there was a fair amount of publicity on a poll that says now the number one issue of concern to the American people is our national security. It passed even jobs in the economy. It's number one. And so I do think the American people are asking that question, and that's a good thing because that puts pressure on us to ask it and hopefully provide some answers. I will say that I think there is no substitute in these matters for presidential leadership, and I don't think that Congress can answer these questions on its own. We're 535 very diverse people, as y'all figured out today. But we have a key role to play under our Constitution, and we need to play that role. We need to fulfill that role with the seriousness it deserves in a very complex, rapidly changing world.
Congressman Thornberry, over here. Congressman Thornberry. Colonel Ken Lowell, Vice President of the MOAA's chapter, great state of New Hampshire. Live free or die. All right. Prior to 9/11, 2001, the National Guard and the Reserve components were part of the Strategic Reserve. After that date, they became a part of the operational force. And since that time, close to a million of those reserve component soldiers have been called to arms in Operation Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom and other places around the globe. And my question to you is, do you see that precedent that has been set continuing from here forward? And if so, will the funds be made available to ensure that they have the infrastructure resources that they need to continue to be a part of the operational force, that they have those resources made available? Or do we go back to what it was prior to 9/11 in the 90s and prior to our nation being attacked, where they received the short end of the stick, if you will, for a lack of better vernacular?
Yeah. Well, a couple things. One is I'm sure you and most people know I have. Before I had this job, I was subcommittee chair for the subcommittee that oversees Special Operations Command. And you talk to some of those special operators and they would tell you that they would rather be with reserve pilots in some of these key airframes who had more experience in flying them than they would with anybody else. So I think that it is going to always be hard to go back to the way things were because things have changed. And we have been through 14 years of a really integrated force where tremendous strengths from the reserve component have blended with the active duty component to make us as effective as we have been. Now, the rest of the story is what happens under the budget when you start cutting the budget is there's less for everybody. And so, as we've had a shrinking pie, the competition over that shrinking pie has gotten more intense in well, at least the Air Force and the Army, and I'm sure the Navy's time is going to come as well. So we've tried to help sort through some of these issues in this competition for resources, and but the real answer is to quit cutting the budget. Now, it's always good to look at the appropriate roles and missions for the various components of our military. I'm not saying we shouldn't ask the question, but on the other hand, part of the reason that for some people it's gotten kind of nasty is because it has been a shrinking pie, and that's made some really bad choices all the way around. And I hope that we can, as I say, we have turned the corner on the budget, which will help relieve some of that pressure so that we can look at some of the roles and missions for Guard and Reserve in a little clearer light and a little less intense light. And I hope that's where we're headed.
Mr. Chairman, how about one more question?
Sure.
Congressman, Barbara Ramsey, proud retired Army nurse, San Antonio, Texas. As your Texas team, as your Texas proud Army nurse, retired Army, as your Texas team stormed the hill today, and I was surrounded by Red Raiders. They kept trying to draw their swords out.
Gun them down, yeah.
Or their draw their weapons.
Yeah.
We heard chatter. Sorry. We heard weapons that, we heard chatter that there's some support for changing our TRICARE benefit, and you spoke about the Commission's report very strongly. Can you tell us what you anticipate on those changes?
Well, as I alluded, anytime you start messing with healthcare, you're in the most complicated area that any of us ever deal with. And I think we want to be careful about changes that we make in any of these people areas, but especially about in healthcare, because it is so complex and because a change in one area can lead to changes in other areas. I'll just say for myself, I represent a congressional district that is bigger than 13 states. So my one congressional district is bigger than Kentucky, not quite as big as Tennessee. So when the Commission talks about the challenges of access in rural areas, I understand what they're talking about. And that's in rural areas. Now, we've got a whole nother set of access issues when we talk about are the reimbursements enough in order to have providers sign up for the TRICARE program. So I think there's a whole variety of issues on TRICARE that need to be examined, but I believe that the committee is going to be cautious about any of those changes while we try to understand the consequences of various changes. And to tell you the truth, there's some people who argue that we ought to make greater efforts to improve TRICARE before we completely change it for some of the groups as the Commission recommended. Last point is this: I am incredibly fortunate that the chairman of our Personnel Subcommittee is a medical doctor who's a general in the reserves and also a member of Congress. And I have a lot of confidence as he looks at this system where he has been a provider and a patient and trying to sort through what makes the most sense. So, but I think we're going to be cautious about any sort of abrupt changes.